It began as an ordinary spring day, the kind where the air felt alive with the sound of children laughing and the buzz of distant lawnmowers. In the quiet town of West Memphis, Arkansas, the streets were filled with a comforting familiarity, neighbors exchanging greetings, kids racing their bikes, and families preparing for dinner. But on this particular day in 1993, beneath the surface of normalcy, an unspeakable darkness was waiting to reveal itself. Three young boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, pedaled away from their homes that afternoon, their laughter trailing behind them like echoes in the wind. They were only 8 years old, innocent, adventurous, and completely unaware that they would never return home. In a town as tight knit as West Memphis, it was unthinkable that something so horrific could happen here. Yet, as the sun began to set and worried parents paced their homes, dialing neighbors and searching familiar haunts, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. It wasn't just the growing silence or the empty streets. It was something deeper, a sense that the town was on the edge of losing its innocence forever. Little did anyone know, the next 24 hours would uncover a nightmare that would haunt West Memphis for decades. The kind of nightmare that makes you lock your doors at night and question everything you thought you knew about safety, justice, and evil. What happened to Stevie, Michael, and Christopher on that seemingly ordinary day? And how did their tragic disappearance ignite one of the most controversial and chilling investigations in modern history? Stay with me, we're just getting started. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, an uneasy stillness settled over West Memphis. It wasn't unusual for Stevie, Michael, and Christopher to play until the last sliver of daylight faded, but this time something felt different. Dinner plates sat untouched on kitchen tables, and mothers stood by open doors, their calls for their sons echoing into the empty streets. Minutes turned into hours, and the kind of worry that starts as a nagging thought began to grow into full blown panic. Stevie's stepfather, Terry Hobbs, paced the living room while his wife, Pamela, frantically called neighbors. Dana Moore, Michael's mother, grabbed a flashlight and headed out into the dimly lit streets, her voice breaking as she shouted his name into the night. The Byers family was no different. Christopher's father, Mark, drove his truck through the neighborhood, scanning every shadow for a sign of his boy. By the time the first calls to local authorities came in, the community was already mobilizing. Flashlights cut through the darkness as neighbors and police officers combed through backyards, wooded areas, and the familiar spots where children often played. But there was no laughter now, no playful voices echoing from the trees, just an oppressive silence that seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour. The search led them to a patch of woods known as Robin Hood Hills, a place where children often went to explore. The dense trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind, almost as if they knew what was hidden within their shadows. But despite their best efforts, there was no sign of the boys. That night, parents held onto hope with trembling hands, reassuring themselves that the boys must have simply wandered too far and lost track of time. But deep down, a darker thought began to creep in, a thought no parent ever wants to entertain. Where could they be? What could have happened? And why did the night feel so suffocatingly heavy, as though it was hiding something far worse than anyone dared to imagine? The answers, as they would soon discover, would be more terrifying than anyone could have anticipated. The morning light brought no comfort to West Memphis, only a renewed determination to find the missing boys. Search efforts intensified as volunteers, law enforcement, and desperate family members scoured every inch of the town. All eyes turned toward Robin Hood Hills, a patch of dense, tangled woods that had long been a playground for adventure, but now carried an ominous air. Around midday, a local juvenile parole officer made a grim discovery in a shallow creek running through the woods. At first glance, it seemed like a child's shoe caught in the water, but as he moved closer, the reality became impossible to deny. The bodies of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers were found submerged and lifeless, stripped of the vibrancy that had filled their lives just the day before. Shockwaves ripped through the town as news spread. Parents clutched their children tighter, neighbors gathered in stunned silence, and an almost palpable grief settled over West Memphis. How could this happen here? In a place where everyone knew each other, where children rode their bikes freely, how had this unthinkable tragedy unfolded? The details surrounding the discovery raised more questions than answers. The boys had been left in such a manner that investigators immediately suspected foul play. This wasn't an accident, nor was it a random tragedy. Someone had done this, and their motives, whatever they were, seemed horrifyingly deliberate. As the scene was cordoned off, the woods that had once been a place of innocence now felt tainted, suffocating. Every parent in the community began to wonder, was the person responsible someone they knew? Could it be a stranger? Or was it someone who had blended into the fabric of their everyday lives? Law enforcement promised answers. But as they collected evidence and began their investigation, a sense of urgency and fear gripped the town. A killer was out there, and until they were caught, no one in West Memphis felt safe. The search for the truth had begun, but the road to uncovering it would be fraught with controversy, missteps, and revelations that no one could have foreseen. This was only the beginning of a case that would haunt West Memphis and the nation for years to come. With the discovery of the boys' bodies, the weight of the tragedy bore down on the entire town. Fear spread like wildfire, mingling with grief to create a toxic mix of panic and suspicion. Parents no longer let their children out of sight, locking doors and keeping close watch over their families. Whispers of who could do this turned into a collective demand. Someone had to pay. For investigators, the pressure was relentless. The brutality of the crime, combined with the age of the victims, made it clear they were dealing with a cold and calculated killer. But the clock was ticking, and with each passing day, the fear grew louder. Was the perpetrator still lurking in the shadows? Would they strike again? As the community's grief turned to outrage, law enforcement found themselves with an unenviable task. They needed a suspect and fast. Leads were scarce, and the case was unlike anything the small police department had ever encountered. Yet, instead of calming the growing hysteria, the investigation seemed to feed into it, with rumors and speculations gaining momentum. Theories began to form, and one stood out above all others. This had to be the work of something evil, something unnatural. Fueled by the satanic panic that gripped the nation in the 80s and 90s, the idea of a ritualistic killing began to take root. Stories of devil worship and cult activity had long been whispered about in hushed tones, and now, it seemed to some, those fears were manifesting. Investigators latched onto the theory, looking for someone who fit the mold of an outsider, someone who could be easily painted as a suspect in the court of public opinion. It wasn't long before their focus fell on a local teenager, Damien Echols. Known for his unconventional appearance, love of heavy metal music, and interest in alternative spiritual beliefs, Damien became an easy target for a town desperate for answers. But was this lead grounded in evidence, or was it born out of fear and prejudice? The community wanted justice, but in their rush to find someone to blame, were they overlooking the truth? The questions lingered as the investigation gained momentum, but one thing was clear: the path ahead would be as tangled as the woods where the boys were found. The stage was now set for a controversial case that would divide West Memphis and the world. And with each step forward, the search for justice would bring more questions than answers. As the town of West Memphis struggled to process the horror of the boys' murders, a chilling narrative began to emerge, spreading like wildfire through the community. This wasn't just a crime, some believed it was something far more sinister. The whispers of dark rituals, satanic ceremonies, and evil lurking in plain sight grew louder by the day. To understand how these rumors took hold, we must look at the broader cultural backdrop of the time. The late 80s and early 90s were gripped by what became known as the Satanic Panic. Across the United States, communities were consumed by fears of underground cults committing unspeakable acts. Sensational media reports and sensationalized accounts of satanic rituals had planted the idea that evil was always just around the corner, hiding behind the most unexpected faces. For West Memphis, these fears provided a chilling explanation for the unthinkable crime. The fact that the boys' bodies had been left in a wooded area only added fuel to the theory. The forest, once a playground, now felt like a stage for something dark and ritualistic. And to many, the violence seemed too incomprehensible to be the work of a rational mind. It had to be the product of something unnatural. Investigators, influenced by these swirling fears, began to view the case through the lens of the occult. The autopsy reports, though inconclusive, were interpreted in ways that supported the theory of ritualistic elements. It didn't matter that the evidence was circumstantial at best. The town was looking for a story that made sense of the senseless. And into this narrative stepped Damien Echols, a teenager who seemed to embody everything people feared. With his black clothing, interest in Wicca, and love for heavy metal music, he became the perfect scapegoat for a community desperate to cast a shadow over their collective fear. The town didn't see a troubled teenager, they saw the face of the darkness they believed had taken their boys. But was this theory grounded in reality, or was it a product of paranoia? As fear and suspicion grew, the line between fact and fiction blurred, and the investigation veered further from the truth. The idea of satanic involvement consumed the case, creating an almost feverish need to assign guilt. The Satanic Panic had claimed its hold on West Memphis, clouding judgments and guiding the investigation down a path that would soon lead to accusations, arrests, and years of controversy. But the question remained: was the real killer hiding in plain sight, or had the town created a villain to fill the void of their grief? The answers would be far more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. Amid the rising panic and desperate need for answers, the gaze of West Memphis law enforcement fell upon three local teenagers: Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley. At first glance, they seemed like an unlikely trio, three young men with different lives and personalities, brought together by circumstance and their shared status as outsiders in a tight knit community. Damien Echols stood out the most. Tall, pale, and dressed in black, he was the kind of teenager who drew attention wherever he went. His fascination with the occult, Wiccan practices, and heavy metal music only added to the intrigue and suspicion surrounding him. To many in West Memphis, Damien's interests weren't just hobbies, they were signs of something far darker. The town, steeped in the conservative values of the Bible Belt, viewed his differences not as individuality, but as a potential threat. Jason Baldwin, on the other hand, was quieter and less conspicuous. Known for his artistic talent and his love for music, Jason was Damien's closest friend. Though he lacked Damien's more striking characteristics, his association with him painted him with the same brush in the eyes of those looking for someone to blame. Then there was Jessie Misskelley, a 17-year-old with an intellectual disability that made him particularly vulnerable to manipulation. Jessie was more loosely connected to Damien and Jason, but in the search for suspects, that didn't matter. His naivety and suggestibility would soon make him a key figure in the case, though not in the way anyone could have foreseen. For investigators, these three teenagers seemed to fit the profile of what they believed they were dealing with. Damien, in particular, became their focus not because of concrete evidence, but because he represented everything the town feared. He was different, outspoken, and fascinated by subjects that clashed with the community's deeply rooted beliefs. The Satanic Panic had primed the town to see monsters in those who didn't conform, and Damien's goth appearance and alternative beliefs made him an easy target. His friends, Jason and Jessie, were guilty by association, their lives swept up in the growing storm of fear and suspicion. But was there any evidence to support these suspicions, or were the boys being singled out because they didn't fit the mold of what West Memphis considered normal? The spotlight on Damien, Jason, and Jessie was growing brighter, and as the pressure to find the killers intensified, the case against them would begin to take shape not based on fact, but on fear. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, but the question remained, were they turning in the right direction, or had the need for a scapegoat blinded everyone to the truth? The story was about to take a dark and controversial turn. With the pressure mounting and leads running thin, investigators turned their attention to Jessie Misskelley. At just 17, Jessie was a quiet, unassuming teenager, known for being a bit slower than his peers. His intellectual disability made him an unlikely suspect in the eyes of some, but to law enforcement desperate for a breakthrough, Jessie became their focus. Without a lawyer or a parent present, Jessie was brought in for questioning. What began as a routine interview quickly spiraled into hours of relentless interrogation. The officers pushed him, prodding with leading questions and presenting scenarios for him to confirm. Jessie, confused and desperate to appease his interrogators, began to fold under the pressure. Over the course of nearly 12 hours, Jessie's statements evolved, each version of his story bending closer to the narrative the investigators seemed to be constructing. Small admissions turned into larger ones, and as the officers pressed on, Jessie began to say what they wanted to hear, even if it didn't make sense. Key details were inconsistent. At one point, Jessie claimed the boys had been attacked in the morning, even though they were last seen alive in the afternoon. When asked about the weapons used, his answers shifted repeatedly. Investigators overlooked these discrepancies, focusing instead on the fact that Jessie had named Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin as accomplices. By the end of the grueling session, Jessie had confessed to being involved in the murders and implicated his two friends. But the confession, riddled with contradictions and factual inaccuracies, raised immediate doubts among those who heard it. The confession was exactly what investigators had been waiting for a breakthrough to present to the terrified community. They wasted no time publicizing Jessie's statements, framing them as the key to solving the case. But as the details came to light, cracks in the narrative became glaringly obvious. Jessie described events that didn't align with the evidence. He claimed the boys were tied with rope, but they had actually been bound with their own shoelaces. He mentioned the crime taking place in the morning, though witnesses had seen the boys riding their bikes well into the afternoon. When pressed on these contradictions, investigators brushed them aside, insisting the core of the confession was enough to prove guilt. Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin were arrested shortly after, with Jessie's confession as the cornerstone of the case against them. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing the nightmare was over. But beneath the surface, doubts were already beginning to form. Why would someone confess to a crime they didn't commit? For many, Jesse's intellectual disability and the circumstances of the interrogation provided the answer. He had been led into the confession, piecing together a story based on the suggestions and pressure of his interrogators. To some, this was obvious manipulation. To others, it was a desperate attempt by law enforcement to close the case. The confession, shaky as it was, became the foundation for what would follow, a high stakes trial and years of controversy. But for the boys' families and a community still reeling from grief, the question lingered: was the true killer still out there, or had fear and prejudice shaped the arrests? The weight of Jesse's words would haunt not only him, but Damien and Jason as well, as the pursuit of justice took a chilling and divisive turn. The lines between guilt and innocence were already blurring, and the consequences of that blurred line were about to unfold in the courtroom. When news of Jessie Misskelley's confession broke, it was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. The community, desperate for answers, latched onto the narrative that had been building the murders were the work of a satanic cult. The media, hungry for a sensational story, amplified this theory, turning the case into a nationwide spectacle. Television segments, newspaper headlines, and talk shows painted Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley as devil worshipping monsters. Their appearance and interests, black clothing, heavy metal music, and alternative beliefs were no longer just quirks. They were evidence, in the public's eyes, of their guilt. The fear of satanic rituals, already fueled by the broader cultural phenomenon of the Satanic Panic, became a lens through which the community viewed the case. This frenzy blinded many to the gaps and inconsistencies in the investigation. Instead of asking why the evidence didn't match the confession or questioning the lack of a clear motive, the public focused on their fear of the unknown. The teenagers were no longer individuals, they were symbols of the evil that West Memphis believed had infiltrated their town. For Damien, Jason, and Jessie, the court of public opinion had already decided their fate. They weren't just accused, they were condemned long before they even stepped into a courtroom. When the trial began, the prosecution leaned heavily on the satanic angle, knowing it would resonate with the jury and the community. Without concrete physical evidence tying the teenagers to the crime, they relied on circumstantial evidence, Jesse's shaky confession, and the fear that had consumed West Memphis. Damien Echols, as the perceived leader of the group, became the primary target. Prosecutors painted him as a dangerous and remorseless figure, obsessed with the occult and capable of committing unspeakable acts. Jason Baldwin, though quieter and less flamboyant, was portrayed as Damien's loyal follower. Jessie Misskelley's confession was presented as the smoking gun that tied all three together. But as the trial unfolded, glaring issues became apparent. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses, nothing that conclusively placed Damien, Jason, or Jessie at the crime scene. The prosecution's case was built on fear, prejudice, and the assumption that the boys' appearance and interests were proof enough of their guilt. Despite these holes, the trial's outcome seemed inevitable. The jury, drawn from the same community gripped by fear and outrage, struggled to separate fact from emotion. The trial wasn't just about justice for Stevie, Michael, and Christopher. It had become a battle between good and evil in the minds of many. The stakes were highest for Damien, who faced the death penalty. As the trial progressed, it became clear that his life hung in the balance, not because of evidence, but because of the image the prosecution had painted of him. To bolster their case, the prosecution called in so called expert witnesses to testify about satanic rituals and the supposed signs of occult activity in the murders. These witnesses, often with questionable credentials, played a pivotal role in shaping the jury's perception. One expert claimed the crime scene exhibited hallmarks of a satanic ritual, though his analysis lacked scientific backing. His testimony relied on generalizations and stereotypes, equating Damien's interest in Wicca and heavy metal music with an ability to commit such heinous acts. Another witness linked the teenager's music choices to violent behavior, citing debunked studies and outdated theories. These testimonies were not rooted in evidence, but in fear. They painted a picture of Damien, Jason, and Jessie as dangerous cult members without offering anything concrete to support those claims. The defense challenged the credibility of these so called experts, but the damage was already done. The jury, steeped in the same cultural fears as the rest of the town, was all too willing to believe the narrative being spun. This reliance on flawed expert testimony highlighted a deeper problem within the case. Instead of focusing on tangible evidence, the trial had become a spectacle driven by fear and prejudice rather than truth. And for Damien, Jason, and Jesse, the weight of that fear was about to come crashing down in the form of a verdict that would change their lives forever. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read, each word a hammer blow that would ripple through the lives of everyone involved. Damien Echols was sentenced to death, the ultimate punishment for what the prosecution had painted as the mastermind of a brutal, satanic crime. Jason Baldwin, his closest friend, received life without parole, while Jessie Misskelley, who had implicated himself in a coerced confession, was also sentenced to life in prison. The families of the victims wept, believing justice had been served, and the town of West Memphis collectively exhaled. For many, this was the vindication they had been desperate for, a resolution to a nightmare that had gripped the community. But for others, a nagging sense of doubt began to creep in. The defense teams and the families of the convicted boys were shattered. They had fought not just against the evidence, but against a tide of fear and prejudice. Now they were left with the crushing reality that three young men had been condemned, not because of solid proof, but because of the town's overwhelming need to find someone to blame. Damien, Jason, and Jesse sat in their respective cells, their lives forever altered. For Damien, the specter of death loomed large as he awaited his fate on death row. But even as the town tried to move on, the seeds of doubt were already beginning to take root, and the story of the West Memphis Three was far from over. In the years that followed, cracks in the case began to emerge, and the voices questioning the verdict grew louder. Independent journalists, legal advocates, and even filmmakers started digging deeper into the trial, uncovering glaring inconsistencies and procedural missteps. The Paradise Lost documentary series, released just a few years after the trial, shone a harsh light on the investigation and courtroom proceedings. It exposed how fear and hysteria had influenced the case, from the coerced confession to the reliance on questionable expert testimony. Audiences around the world were shocked, and support for Damien Jason, and Jessie began to grow. High-profile celebrities like Eddie Vedder, Johnny Depp, and Natalie Maines of the Dixie Chicks lent their voices to the cause, using their platforms to draw attention to the case. Legal experts joined the fight, highlighting how the lack of physical evidence and the reliance on cultural bias had led to a miscarriage of justice. For the first time, the West Memphis Three had hope. But hope alone wasn't enough, they needed proof, something tangible to dismantle the case against them. And with the advent of new technology, the possibility of uncovering that proof was closer than ever. As the years passed, advancements in DNA technology offered a chance to re examine the evidence from Robin Hood Hills. Hopes were high that science could finally provide clarity, either by confirming the guilt of Damien, Jason, and Jessie, or by proving their innocence once and for all. When the testing was complete, the results sent shockwaves through everyone involved. None of the DNA recovered from the crime scene matched Damien, Jason, or Jessie. Instead, the testing pointed to other, unidentified individuals, further evidence that the three teenagers had been convicted not based on fact, but on fear. The results reignited the debate around the case, with supporters of the West Memphis Three growing louder and more determined. Legal teams pushed for their release, armed with this new evidence and a renewed sense of urgency. Yet, the state of Arkansas resisted, unwilling to admit that the justice system might have gotten it wrong. But the DNA evidence was undeniable, raising a haunting question. If Damien, Jason, and Jesse didn't commit the crime, then who did? The specter of the true killer, still walking free, hung over the case, deepening the tragedy for both the boys' families and the wrongfully convicted. The fight for justice was far from over, but the DNA results had shifted the narrative. The West Memphis Three weren't just convicts, they were victims of a flawed system, and their story was about to take another dramatic turn. As doubt over the convictions of Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley grew, so did the movement to free them. What began as whispers among legal advocates and independent journalists transformed into a full-blown crusade. The release of the Paradise Lost documentaries had pulled back the curtain on the injustices of the case, exposing flaws in the investigation and the trial. This revelation caught the attention of activists, celebrities, and ordinary people who were outraged by what they saw. Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, actor Johnny Depp, and Natalie Maines of the Dixie Chicks became some of the most vocal advocates for the West Memphis Three. They raised awareness, donated money for legal fees, and used their platforms to rally public support. Benefit concerts were held, interviews given, and campaigns launched to shine a light on the teenagers' plight. Beyond the star power, legal experts joined the fight, armed with new forensic evidence and a critical analysis of the original trial. Organizations dedicated to justice and wrongful convictions highlighted the case as a stark example of how fear, prejudice, and flawed processes could ruin lives. They called for a re examination of the evidence and a fair retrial. The growing momentum couldn't be ignored. Public opinion began to shift, and the pressure on Arkansas officials intensified. It was no longer just about three young men sitting behind bars. It was about accountability, truth, and the integrity of the justice system. After nearly 18 years of incarceration, the West Memphis Three were presented with a bittersweet opportunity for freedom. In 2011, they entered into an Alford plea, a rare legal maneuver allowing them to maintain their innocence, while acknowledging that the prosecution might have enough evidence to convict them again in a retrial. This plea was a compromise, a way for the state to avoid admitting fault while releasing the men from prison. The decision wasn't easy for Damien, who had spent years on death row, and for Jason and Jessie, who had endured life sentences. The plea was both a victory and a heartbreak. Accepting it meant walking free, but it also meant giving up the chance to clear their names completely. When the three men stepped out of the courthouse, they were greeted by a crowd of supporters. Cheers erupted, tears flowed, and for the first time in almost 2 decades, they were free. But the shadow of injustice lingered. They were no longer prisoners, but they weren't truly exonerated either. The state's refusal to fully admit wrongdoing left a bitter taste for the men and their supporters. The fight for justice wasn't over, it had simply entered a new chapter. The West Memphis Three were free, but the truth about what happened in Robin Hood Hills remained elusive. With Damien, Jason, and Jessie released, the focus turned to the question that had haunted the case from the start. If they didn't commit the crime, then who did? Speculation swirled around several individuals, many of whom had been close to the boys. One theory pointed to Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of Stevie Branch. His inconsistent statements and the discovery of his DNA on evidence at the crime scene raised eyebrows. Another theory implicated a local man with a history of violent behavior, though concrete ties to the murders were never established. Other theories ranged from random strangers passing through town to members of the community who had gone unnoticed during the original investigation. Each lead was debated and dissected, but none provided the definitive answer the families of Stevie, Michael, and Christopher desperately sought. The lack of resolution left a cloud of uncertainty. While many believed the West Memphis Three were innocent, the absence of an alternate suspect fueled lingering doubts in the minds of some. The true killer or killers had never faced justice, leaving the case as much a mystery now as it was in 1993. The story of the West Memphis Three became more than just a case, it became a symbol of the dangers of moral panic, flawed investigations, and a justice system that can fail those it is meant to protect. The case highlighted how prejudice and fear could lead to the wrongful imprisonment of innocent people and how a rush to judgment could overshadow the search for truth. The cultural impact of the case was profound. It spurred reforms in forensic science, including the use of DNA testing to exonerate the wrongfully convicted. It also brought attention to the need for better legal protections for vulnerable individuals like Jessie Misskelley during interrogations. For Damien, Jason, and Jessie, life outside prison has been a complicated mix of freedom and frustration. They've worked to rebuild their lives while continuing to advocate for full exoneration and justice for the three boys whose lives were tragically cut short. The case remains a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how easily fear can warp justice and how important it is to question, investigate, and demand the truth. For West Memphis, the scars of 1993 have never fully healed. And for the rest of us, the story of the West Memphis Three is a haunting testament to the human cost of getting it wrong. Even with the West Memphis Three free and the passage of years, one haunting truth remains. This case is still unsolved. The murders of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers left an indelible scar on West Memphis, and for their families, the pain of losing their children has never lessened. The lack of a definitive answer as to who committed these heinous crimes only deepens their anguish. For Damien, Jason, and Jessie, nearly 2 decades behind bars for a crime they didn't commit stole the most formative years of their lives. They walked out of prison as free men, but their fight for exoneration and the weight of public scrutiny have lingered. They live as symbols of a flawed system, but also as men forever tied to a crime that remains a dark mystery. The questions are endless. Who took the lives of three innocent boys on that spring day in 1993? Was justice ever truly served, or did the real killer escape unnoticed? And why, after all these years, has the truth remained elusive? These questions cast a long shadow, leaving a gaping void where answers should be. This case is a chilling reminder of how easily fear and prejudice can shape justice, and how devastating the consequences can be when those we trust to protect the truth fall short. The story of the West Memphis Three isn't just about a wrongful conviction. It's about the lives of Stevie, Michael, and Christopher, who were robbed of their futures and whose families deserve the peace of knowing the truth. The time has come to renew the call for justice. With advancements in forensic technology and the continued efforts of advocates, there is still hope that the real killer or killers can be identified. We owe it to the memory of the boys, to their grieving families, and to those who were wrongfully accused to keep pushing for the truth. So, what happens next? That depends on all of us, on those who continue to demand accountability, on those who refuse to let this case fade into history, and on those who fight to ensure that justice is more than just a word. If this case has taught us anything, it's the importance of questioning what we think we know and pursuing the truth, no matter where it leads. The story of the West Memphis Three isn't over, and the search for justice continues. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the real killer will ever be found? And what does this case tell us about the justice system as a whole? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Crime Pulse Stories, and stay tuned as we continue to uncover the most chilling, unresolved mysteries. Justice for Stevie, Michael, and Christopher is still waiting to be found. Will you be part of the effort to uncover it?